Do you consider yourself a proud person? Or perhaps you believe that everything you have is the result of your own ability? This video will make you rethink your life. In today's story, we're going to talk about King Nebuchadnezzar, a biblical narrative that resonates with lessons of humility and divine sovereignty. Today we're going to explore the trajectory of this powerful monarch who ruled Babylon with greatness and pride, until he was humbled by God and turned into a wild animal. Nebuchadnezzar began his journey as a proud king, responsible for magnificent conquests and splendid architectural works, such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. However, his arrogance led to his drastic downfall, fulfilling the prophecy of the prophet Daniel. This astonishing story highlights the powerful message that your greatness is absolutely nothing compared to the greater power that governs all things. Nebuchadnezzar's story is an eternal testimony to God's justice and mercy, a tale of pride, downfall, and redemption that continues to inspire generations. For those of you who have subscribed to this channel, I'd like to ask you to like it, and for those of you who are just getting started, I challenge you to subscribe to this channel. Believe me, the stories we tell here will change the way you look at life. Let's get to today's story. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of ancient Babylon, where the aroma of spices mingles with the sound of conversations in different languages. This was a vibrant city, a center of culture and commerce that flourished under the rule of a man whose name resonated with power and authority, Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar ascended the Babylonian throne in 605 BC after the death of his father, Nabopolassar. From the outset, he proved to be an ambitious leader and strategist. With a grand vision, he expanded the Babylonian Empire, conquering vast territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His military campaigns were successful, consolidating Babylon as the dominant power in the region. In addition to his military conquests, Nebuchadnezzar is remembered for his impressive architectural works. These include the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Imagine a paradise of lush vegetation with plants and flowers of every color growing on raised terraces. It is said that Nebuchadnezzar had these gardens built for his wife Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her native Middle-earth. The gardens were a spectacular feat of engineering, with an innovative irrigation system that brought water from the river Euphrates to feed the plants. The city of Babylon, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, was a testimony to his glory. Its walls were imposing, protecting a treasure trove of palaces, temples, and wide avenues. The famous Ishtar Gate, adorned with blue tiles and figures of sacred animals, was the main entrance to the city, leaving all visitors in awe of its beauty and majesty. However, behind all this glory, there was a dark side. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of great pride and arrogance. He believed that his conquests and achievements were exclusively the result of his skill and power. This unbridled pride led him away from humility and the recognition of divine sovereignty. He repeatedly ignored the warnings and advice of sages and prophets, preferring to rely on his own strength. This arrogance and disrespect for God would eventually lead Nebuchadnezzar to a surprising and humiliating fall. His trajectory of power and glory would become a classic example of how divine sovereignty can humble even the mightiest of men. Nebuchadnezzar's story is not only about his conquests and achievements, but also about his transformation and belated recognition of the true source of all power. By exploring the life of Nebuchadnezzar, we can see a fascinating portrait of a king whose greatness was undeniable, but whose arrogance led him to a lesson in divine humility. His story teaches us that, regardless of how high we may ascend, it is essential to remember that there is a greater power that governs all things, and Nebuchadnezzar ignored that higher power. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream, something that seemed more like a vision than a simple dream. He found himself transported to a vast field, where a majestic tree stood in the center of the earth. This tree was impressive, with its height reaching to the heavens and its branches spreading across the length and breadth of the land. Its leaves were green and shiny, and its abundant fruit provided food for all living things. The tree's shade provided shelter for the animals of the field, and the birds of the air made their nests in its branches. It was a vision of prosperity and security, a symbol of life and sustenance for all creation. Suddenly the scene changed. A heavenly messenger, a watchman descended from heaven, appeared in the midst of the vision. His presence was imposing, and his voice echoed like thunder as he proclaimed, "Cut down the tree and cut off its branches, tear off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and the roots, bound with iron and bronze, in the middle of the grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let its portion be with the animals among the plants of the earth." Nebuchadnezzar woke up with his heart racing, disturbed by the meaning of the dream. He knew that this vision carried a profound message and possibly a divine warning. Determined to understand the dream, he summoned all the wise men, magicians, enchanters, and astrologers in his kingdom. However, despite their wisdom and knowledge, none of them could interpret the dream. Frustrated and anxious, Nebuchadnezzar then remembered Daniel, a young Hebrew exile who had previously demonstrated great wisdom and the ability to interpret dreams. Daniel was summoned to the king's presence. Nebuchadnezzar told him the dream in all its details, waiting anxiously for the interpretation. Daniel, with his God-given wisdom, listened attentively and, for a moment, remained silent, realizing the gravity of the message. With a heavy heart, Daniel finally spoke. "My lord, the tree you saw, so tall and majestic, is the king himself. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the heavens, and your dominion extends to the ends of the earth." Daniel went on to explain that the heavenly messenger's order to cut down the tree represented an impending judgment on Nebuchadnezzar. Because of his pride and arrogance, the king would be stripped of his throne and lose his sanity. He would live among the beasts of the field, eating grass like the oxen, being wet by the dew of heaven. This condition would last until Nebuchadnezzar recognized that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and that he grants power to whomever he wishes. Despite the seriousness of the message, Daniel also offered a hope of redemption. The fact that the stump and roots of the tree would be left meant that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be restored once he recognized God's sovereignty. Daniel then advised the king to abandon his sins and practice justice, showing mercy to the oppressed, so that perhaps his prosperity could continue. Nebuchadnezzar listened to Daniel's interpretation and advice, but his proud heart was not yet ready to humble itself. The divine warning was clear, but the king continued on his path of arrogance, not realizing that the fulfillment of that vision was fast approaching. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation and humiliation would be inevitable, revealing to all that true power and glory belong to God alone. 12 months had passed since Daniel's disturbing interpretation of the dream. During this time, Nebuchadnezzar continued to rule with the same confidence and pride as always, apparently immune to the warnings he had received. The city of Babylon, with its grandiose walls and monuments, continued to flourish, and the king was convinced that his power and wisdom were responsible for all this magnificence. One day, Nebuchadnezzar was walking along the terrace of his majestic palace. The sun was shining brightly, illuminating Babylon's imposing structures. He looked out over the vastness of his city, with its bustling streets, splendid temples, and legendary hanging gardens. Feeling invincible, he proclaimed, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built as a royal residence, with the strength of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" These words of self-exaltation had barely left his lips when a mighty sound resounded from the heavens. At that very moment, a voice came from heaven declaring, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, it is said to you, your kingdom has been taken from you. You shall be driven from among men and live with the beasts of the field. You shall eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you recognize that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whom he will." Daniel's prophecy was being fulfilled at that moment. Nebuchadnezzar's sanity suddenly disappeared, and he was seized by a state of madness. Thrown out of his palace and stripped of his position of power, Nebuchadnezzar wandered the countryside, without the understanding and dignity that once characterized him as a king. He began to live like a wild animal, eating grass like the oxen, his skin constantly wet with dew from the sky. Time was merciless with him. His hair grew long and tangled, resembling eagle feathers, while his nails lengthened and curved like birds' claws. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation was total and humiliating. He who had once commanded armies and ruled a vast empire was now reduced to a bestial existence. The days and nights dragged on, and he was completely forgotten by men, a living reminder of God's supreme power over the kingdoms of the earth. During this period, the indomitable nature of his life reflected his inner condition, broken and directionless, like a lost creature. This transformation was not just a punishment, but a lesson in the true source of power and authority. God, in his wisdom, allowed Nebuchadnezzar to experience human frailty in its most extreme form. The king's pride was destroyed, replaced by a reality of total dependence and recognition of divine sovereignty. This period of humiliation was necessary for Nebuchadnezzar to understand that all earthly power is temporary and subordinate to the will of the Most High. Thus Nebuchadnezzar lived out his days like an animal, fulfilling Daniel's prophecy, while his kingdom awaited the restoration of its king. Nebuchadnezzar's fall was a remarkable event that echoed throughout Babylon, reminding everyone that even the greatest of kings is subject to God's power. Prophecy had been fulfilled, and God's supremacy had been demonstrated beyond doubt. Nebuchadnezzar would learn the hard way that true glory and power belong to God alone. After a period of 7 years living in a state of complete humiliation and desolation, something extraordinary happened in Nebuchadnezzar's life. During all this time, he had been reduced to a bestial condition, living among the beasts of the field, eating grass and being wet with dew. His days were filled with the monotonous repetition of a purposeless existence, far from the glory and power he had once known. However, this phase of his life was about to come to an end. In a moment of clarity, Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes to heaven. This simple act of looking up symbolized much more than a physical gesture. It was a sign of recognition, a search for something greater, and an acceptance of his own smallness in the face of the universe. He who had been consumed by pride and arrogance finally humbled himself before the majesty of the Most High. In that instant of humility, his sanity returned. When Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, he understood the lesson God had taught him. He understood that true power and dominion did not belong to him, but to God, who rules over all the kingdoms of the earth and grants authority to whom he wills. This revelation transformed Nebuchadnezzar profoundly, both in his mind and in his spirit. He was no longer the arrogant king who believed he was the architect of his own glory. Now he was a man who recognized divine supremacy and his own insignificance before the Creator. Nebuchadnezzar returned to his palace and was restored to the throne, but his restoration was marked by a profound change of heart. The people of Babylon, who had witnessed the fall and humiliation of their king, now saw a leader transformed by experience. Nebuchadnezzar not only resumed his role as ruler, but also became a fervent proclaimer of God's glory. He made a point of publicly declaring that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and that his dominion is eternal. In his words, Nebuchadnezzar praised and honored the Most High, saying, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven, for all that he does is right, and all his ways are just, and he has power to humble those who walk in arrogance." This confession of faith and recognition of God's sovereignty was a powerful testimony not only to his own people, but also to the neighboring kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation was complete and evident in his conduct and governance. He began to lead with a new perspective, guided by the understanding that all human power is temporary and subject to God's will. This change in attitude brought a period of peace and renewed prosperity to Babylon. As the king, now humble and wise, sought to rule with justice and compassion. Thus, the story of Nebuchadnezzar teaches us that God's sovereignty is unquestionable, and that pride precedes the fall. True power does not lie in our achievements or titles, but in the humility of recognizing the greatness of the Most High. Nebuchadnezzar, once proud and arrogant, became a living example of the transformation that can take place when we submit to God's will. His journey of humiliation and redemption is an eternal testimony to divine mercy and power. reminding us that we are all under the dominion of the King of Heaven, whose rule is just and eternal. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is a powerful lesson in humility and recognizing God's sovereignty. This monarch, who began his journey as a proud and arrogant king, was humiliated to the point of living like an animal, only to be restored after recognizing the true power of God. The narrative shows us that, regardless of the greatness and power we can achieve, we must always remember that there is a greater power that rules over all things. Nebuchadnezzar, through his transformation, left a legacy of reverence and humility before the Most High, a teaching that resonates to this day. Let's reflect on the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's journey. He was a king who, by his own understanding, had reached the pinnacle of power and glory. His military conquests, his grandiose architectural works, such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and the expansion of his empire, all these achievements convinced him of his invincibility. Nebuchadnezzar believed himself to be the author of his greatness, forgetting the true source of all power. This pride was the beginning of his downfall, because in believing that he himself was the reason for his magnificence, he ignored God's sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation was extreme and complete. Living like a wild animal, eating grass wet with dew, with hair and nails growing out of control, was an experience that destroyed any vestige of his former arrogance. For 7 long years, he was left to reflect on his condition, a vivid reminder that human power is fragile and temporary. This painful experience was, however, a preparation for his transformation. God, in his wisdom, knew that Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation would be the path to his redemption and recognition of divine truth. Nebuchadnezzar's restoration was not only physical, but above all spiritual. When he finally raised his eyes to heaven and praised God, he demonstrated a profound change of heart. By recognizing the supremacy of the Most High, Nebuchadnezzar not only regained his sanity, but was also restored to his throne. This return to power, however, was marked by a new attitude of humility and reverence. He publicly proclaimed that God is the true ruler of the kingdoms of men, a recognition that transformed his leadership and brought a new period of peace and prosperity to Babylon. The story of Nebuchadnezzar offers us valuable lessons. Firstly, it warns us about the dangers of pride and arrogance. When we forget to recognize the source of our blessings and fill ourselves with vanity, we are paving our own way to the fall. Secondly, the narrative demonstrates God's mercy and justice. Although Nebuchadnezzar was severely punished, his humiliation was an act of grace, allowing him to recognize his mistakes and redeem himself. Finally, the story reminds us that true greatness comes from recognizing God's sovereignty and living in humility and reverence before him. Nebuchadnezzar, through his transformation, left a legacy of reverence and humility before the Most High, a teaching that resonates to this day. His journey of pride, fall, and redemption is a powerful testimony to God's sovereignty over all things. It shows us that, regardless of the position we hold or the achievements we make, we must always remember that there is a greater power that governs everything. As we learn from the story of Nebuchadnezzar, we are called to live in humility, recognizing that all power and glory belongs to God. And so the story of Nebuchadnezzar leaves us with an eternal lesson: that pride precedes the fall, but humility before God is the path to true greatness and restoration. May we always remember to look to heaven, recognize divine sovereignty, and live our lives in reverence and gratitude to the Most High, who rules with eternal justice and love. Remember, everything you have has been allowed by God. If, knowing this, you remain in the ignorance of being an arrogant person, perhaps God will take you through the same experience as Nebuchadnezzar to convert your heart. Consecrate everything you have to God and recognize that without Him you are nothing, just a passing mist. If you liked this video, leave a like. And if this message was important to you, write in the comments what you learned from this video. May God always be praised. See you in the next video.